Dannie-Lu. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. It's always lovely to see you and talk about creative things.
Absolutely. Have you been well over the past year?
It's been a challenge, but yes, not too bad at all, and actually been quite a time of creativity at
Good.
this end. How about you? How have you been?
Yeah, good, good. I've really been enjoying these conversations all about stories this year.
I know it's a great topic.
Yeah, you said yes. And
Yeah.
I know like stories. I, the the talk that I heard you do first was a TED talk where that was a couple of years ago, and with TED talks, they're very often story based, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They are. Yeah, I think it gives it context, doesn't it? It really helps people to get straight into the heart of something very, very
And
quickly.
and I suppose that because you and I and others who do similar work to
Mm,
ourselves in anything to do with the social sciences,
yeah.
is I find I haven't really heard anybody say, well, stories are not important. So we're speaking to the converted, and then there are subjects like the natural sciences, the life sciences, where it's more about facts and it's more about logic. So how do you use storytelling when you have an audience who is not naturally inclined to telling
Mhm.
stories?
Yeah. Oh God, that's a good question. I always say to clients and also remind myself when I'm positioning anything or working on anything really, that the power is a combination often of stories and facts. Like they almost sit when you have both of them in existence, that is like your bullseye. Because I think what happens is you cover this is very overview-esque, but you cover in kind of both sides of the brain because you're going facts, logic, numericals, data, and then you're going, and there's the story, and this is how they sit together. And for me, that's a lovely way to integrate, the sciences and the more kind of factual based things with the more creative based things.
Yeah, like for example, values. If I were to explain to you that what my values are, that might sound quite boring. If I say I value courage, I mean, what does that mean? Whereas
Yeah,
if you tell you a story around it, then you can relate to that story and interpret the story and make it mean what is useful to you.
absolutely. Yeah, it just gives it that context, doesn't it? That makes it so much more relatable and joins the dots for people. And I think it's that thing that with story, we share our common experiences, even though you might feel really like you don't have very much in common with another human being. The minute someone shares a story, you're able to relate somehow. And that's so powerful for that.
Especially if that story has emotion, because we've all experienced anger, we've all experienced betrayal, we've all experienced sadness, grief, loss of a loved
Exactly.
one.
Yeah.
So when that story expresses the emotion, we can empathize, and it's through that empathy we become kind of entangled, I suppose, in the
Yeah.
story.
Definitely, definitely. It plays into that emotional intelligence as well. We really relate to people like that. We get our compassion in that way. And we can find other perspectives through story, which is another powerful thing that they do.
Yeah, because you can, you find yourself thinking, oh, I never thought about it from that point of view. It's like
Exactly.
somebody who is so different to yourself. Like this
Mm.
is one of the reasons why I love to listen to stories of those who I don't really like what their message is, but I
Mhm.
want to hear what their stories are, because I want to see where they're coming from, with
Yeah.
messages that they're.
Yeah. It gives context, doesn't it? It gives context or we can make the sense of in that. And I love that example that you've just shared because it's that thing of, oh, why do they think that? Why would they think that's a good idea? Why on earth would they, be pushing for that bit of legislation or whatever? And then you hear their story and you're able to go, oh, that plus that could equal that for them.
Mm.
It gives a deep understanding very fast.
Mhm. And people say to us, I see where you're coming from. Once we've told them our story,
Yeah.
I see where you're coming from. And
Yeah.
think about identity, values, and behavior. It's like
Mm.
very often, it's as though one of the most effective ways to change behavior is to change our own identity. For example, if I identify as being a teacher, I behave in a particular way. But if I identify with being, I don't know, a designer, for example,
Mm.
I will behave in a totally different way. I have different responsibilities and my behavior is different. And so for you, what is that relationship? Is it a linear relationship between identities and behavior, or is it, that we can work backwards from behavior? There's that whole behaviorist approach.
I think it's frozen. Oh, there we go. You froze momentarily, I think. I hadn't thought about this before.
Because with behaviorism, they Skinner, his experiments following on from Pavlov's dog's experiments, it was all about that behavior is all about stimulus response. If we get rewarded for something, we will do more of that. If we get punished for behavior, we'll do less of that. And that our identities, our self-concept is as a consequence of the behavior that has been rewarded or punished. Whereas the other way of looking at things is that, well, no, identity has to come first, and then our behavior emerges from our identity. What for you is kind of like the starting point?
I would say, for the most part, I would say it's identity, and the behavior comes from identity, but I don't think it's ever fully one. I think it can loop around in different ways. It's that whole concept of, our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are inherently linked, and one will always influence the other. And sometimes we can start with the thoughts and the feelings, which is where particularly story of identity is, which then impacts behavior. But sometimes we can start with behavior, and living an experience or a particular theory through behaviors can then shift how we see ourselves or how we see something else. So it can work either way, actually.
Yeah, and it's probably like a feedback loop between the two. It's so say, for example, if somebody gets promoted into a senior management position, might be that they don't identify even with being a manager, but they are in that role, so they start behaving that way, and then after behaving as a senior manager, they take on that identity. Or otherwise it could be that they're not a manager, it's somebody who is like working on the factory floor basically, but they identify with being a manager, and because of the way they're behaving, the way they dress even, they get promoted because of their self-identity.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I did a piece of work, actually, funnily enough, this year, a big piece of work around story and, the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell others, and what is conscious and what's less conscious, and how do they benefit and how do they limit. And actually, that was a really useful piece of work to delve into, because actually we don't often look at, well, hang on, what stories am I telling myself, and what stories am I, sort of sending out there, which we might not always be aware of, and then what impact does that have? And then to rewrite them or reposition them or just even question them as like a hypothesis can be a useful exercise in, I've had a shift of perception now.
Yeah, it's, that TV program, Who Do You Think You Are?
Yes.
People trace their ancestry, and it's like when they discover stories about their ancestors, they come away from that with a different paradigm of who they are. And
totally. Totally. I have, funnily enough, a personal experience of that, because my dad was adopted, and we were always, me and my sisters at school, people were like, oh, are you Spanish? Are you, because we're quite dark, and we thought, oh, maybe there's Spanish in there. And then about 12 years ago, my dad found his real siblings. He didn't know he had siblings. Realized that we have, my grandmother was from Calcutta. We've discovered all this family in Bangalore. And I suddenly was able to go, oh, that's where this part of me might come from. Or this is where this, this tendency might come from. And suddenly it was like a missing part of the jigsaw. So I think for me in identity, I really relate to that who do you think you are piece, because it did definitely shift how I saw myself in the world. But it took time. At first, it was a little bit disorientating, because I was like, oh, I'm not who I thought I was. And yeah, it's an interesting thing.
That is very powerful. Yes, that's a great example of, you have this self-identity of like thinking for thousands of years, this is the land where we have, and then suddenly you find out that actually half of your family
Yeah.
came from the other side of the world. And
Exactly. And I always think since then I'm like, everyone should do a DNA test, because it makes us realize like we are just all of the world. And if we all had that perception, I just think, wow, so much would change globally.
yes.
A huge
And,
thought. But
and that leads me to the question about, our DNA, like our ancestral memories, our stories, are they locked in our DNA somehow? Do we have, even before you found out this fact about your family being from, from India, was that part of your DNA? Was it like an unconscious memory that was perhaps making you behave in certain ways and, have preferences that were distinct from others?
Yeah, it's a good question. All I know is when I found that out, a lot suddenly made sense. I felt like, and I don't know whether that was psychological or whether that was actual, but I am very fascinated by how we, the whole concept of ancestral trauma, for example, or how we carry these stories, and is it learned, or is it, like you say, in our DNA? And I think there's a lot more in our DNA than we perhaps realize, and I think we're still discovering to what extent that is a thing.
Yeah, because I was born in the Punjab, and you may know that the Punjab was partitioned in 1947. So half of the Punjab went into Pakistan and half remained in India. And so I know that, I come from a village which was established by my forefathers about 350 years ago. And I've often wanted to know, where were they before? Where were they before that? And I saw something on the internet to say that they came from Lahore. Lahore is now in Pakistan.
Yeah.
When I found, that could be like, I'm not sure if it's a fact or not a fact, because it's something I found on the internet, but it made sense.
Yeah.
It was almost as though I know that because I felt it, because every time.
Cellular thing, isn't it? You kind of go, oh yes.
I know, yeah, that I know that. I know that. And how do I know that? Well, you can kind of feel it, because every time I've heard the name Lahore before, even though it's in Pakistan, I felt connected with Lahore.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's like our body knows, our body keeps hold of things, and I think they are passed on. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it, that it's passed on in utero and through genetics and all of that. You think, oh, okay, that's, it's fascinating. It's made me delve into the history of India a lot more. I'm much more fascinated by what's the history of India, what's going on here, what happened here, and there's one almighty history to delve into, of course, which is perspective changing in itself.
Yes. So in terms of lived experience, so that's one story, the story of our own lived experience, and the story of like the dominant story, like how are we a part of the culture, the dominant culture, because with our story within this bigger story, how do we fit in? How do you know that the story, like the bigger story that you're a part of, how do you know it's the story that you want to be a part of? Is it simply a question of like, well, I'm growing, I'm thriving, I'm flourishing? Is it simply that? Or is it something else that helps us to determine whether we're in the right place? Are we in the right story?
It's probably a combination, similarly to that physical resonance that we've just discussed around ancestry. We have that in the present if we pay attention. But that said, sometimes things happen in life where you think, oh, this isn't nice, this is unpleasant, this is a shock, or whatever the sort of the journey of life, if you will. And yet there are times when it sort of makes sense. You think, well, this is happening for a reason. And definitely when you look back with hindsight, you can, oh, that probably happened because of this, that, and the other. And I wouldn't be here now if this horrible thing hadn't happened. So some of it's down to trust, and some of it, the thriving and the feeling like you belong is definitely part of the story. I mean, for example, I was brought up in the Northeast. I left there and moved to London when I was 20, lived there for 23 years, something like that, and then moved down to Sussex, Hastings area. And since I moved here, I felt more than ever, oh, I really belong here. And it's so far away, like geographically, than, from where I was raised. And yet I feel really like I belong here. So that sense of belonging and identity and the story around you is huge. And it's a feeling.
Yeah, because we create chapters in our life, don't we? You know, like
Yeah.
our story, it's like, well, some chapters can be much longer than other chapters. You know, you talk about moving from place to place, and sometimes the chapters in our life are demarcated by our physical location, and sometimes they're marked by relationships. You know, we have a different set of friends, and it's like, and then we move away from that sort of, it could still be in the same city that or the same environment, but you've just moved on. And it's like, yeah, we create chapters, and we know when a chapter has come to an end because it's no longer, there's no more kind of substance in it.
Yeah, you feel it. It's a feeling. It's an emptiness, or there's not this. I liked your word thrive, because that's very key. I feel I'm not thriving anymore. I'm feeling stifled. That's a real clue that there's a new chapter. I like the chapter thing too. That's useful shorthand, isn't it? Of like, okay, this one's closing, but now it's time for something new.
And the two kind of, one is about thriving and one is about facing challenge. Sometimes when we are in a situation where we're facing challenges, thriving is like, you know, cutting through those challenges, not running away from them.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the resilience piece, isn't it? Where we get the challenges, and we get the hardships, and it's the pushing through that builds the resilience, which equally can feel like part of the story, or part of like, okay, I'm being tested now. This is something I need to rise to. This is the challenge. Am I going to meet it, or am I going to back off from it? Yeah, and that in itself, I think, is a story I tell myself about my identity. Like, oh, I've had to fight, I've had to push, I've had to do, you know, weather some hard stuff. It's probably true of all humans, you know, in fact, in different ways. But for me, I've definitely taken that on as an identity of like, I can fight through. I've got this warrior spirit in me. I can fight through. And that's interesting. I'm not really sure where I picked that up from, whether that came from me or whether someone said it to me at some point. And then I thought, oh, I'm going to take that on.
Well, that's like, well, that reminds me of the archetypes, you know, the warrior spirit. It's like the hero, you know, and then archetypes are also roles that we choose, and sometimes people can become so attached to one particular role rather than using that role at the right time, at the right place. There's a time to be a warrior, but not all the time.
Yeah, it's exhausting all the time. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? We assume these roles, and I think, you know, if for women in particular, there are definite rules that are marked out by society sometimes that we can follow, and actually to challenge those archetypes is tough, but sometimes very freeing.
You know, like when little girls play with Barbie dolls, and they have this kind of dream of becoming Barbie and marrying, is it Ken?
And yeah.
and that's fine and good, as long as it's not the only option, you know, as long as, you know, to know that there is a choice, you know, you can be that and lots of other things as well.
Exactly. And I think that bigger story out there is starting to change, and those story options are starting to open up, definitely for females, which is a good thing, and not before time.
Okay, so in terms of mystery then, so you know a lot about the influence and the impact of stories, you know how to use stories, you do use stories, but what is still mysterious? What do you feel that we still need to be exploring about this relationship between our success in terms of our behavior and the stories that we tell ourselves, stories that we allow ourselves to be influenced by?
The question of origin is still mysterious. Like, where did that story come from, and why am I adhering to it or putting myself within it somehow? That, you know, that questioning of where does this come from, and is it serving me, or is there another option, or could there be a completely different lens from which to view this, is still mysterious. Like, why do we adhere or gravitate towards a particular story structure within our own lives? That's interesting to me. And the mystery of, I think, the story order that we follow, you know, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Why does it have to be in that order? Why can't it all be simultaneous? Can't it all? I know that it can feel a bit quantum-esque, but actually, what if we flip a story on its head? What if we turn it around the other way? That is, in my opinion, underexplored at this point in time.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because usually we start with the story of creation, you know,
Mm.
how did we get here on earth?
Yeah.
And then we take like, and then it's a journey from that point to where are we going?
Mm.
You know, are we going, is it about going to another planet? You know, is that the purpose of life, to discover how we can inhabit other parts of the galaxy? Or is there something, you know, what is our story about what happens to us when we are no longer physically around? You know, what is that story? Because that has whatever our story is about, that will shape our behavior as well, won't it?
Definitely, definitely. And there was an interesting thing that I heard. I was listening to a Billy Connolly interview that was quite old, actually, a few days ago, and he was making a joke about when people say someone's middle-aged, and he said, "How do you know I'm in the? How do you know I'm middle-aged? Maybe I'm going to die next week. Maybe I'm not even halfway. Like, what is middle-aged?" And I found that interesting, like the timeline of our lives, like the story we tell ourselves about that, and the behaviors that we think we should adopt at particular times in our life. I thought that's quite an interesting thing to challenge too. You know.
So what is your story about where we come from?
Oh, my story about where we come from. I flit around, actually. I used to be much more kind of Darwin-esque, and kind of go, okay, evolution, Big Bang, science, you know, all of that. But as I get older, I've become more kind of spiritual, to be honest. I've kind of gone, well, I don't really know, but there seems to be something else going on. And the realm of quantum physics, I find, which I know I mentioned before, is, to me, there's lots in that we could still dig into. So I'm kind of endlessly curious and fascinated about why and how.
Yeah, because, you know, in Hinduism, with the belief in reincarnation, it's like we you know, we're always going to be around in this, you know, until we achieve liberation, then we become part of everything. And then there's the I suppose you may be interested to hear that with colonialization of India, a lot of the education, you know, a lot of the Hindu knowledge that existed or that exists, a lot of it was reshaped, remolded by the British in terms of the education, because it didn't fit in with the biblical truths. And so when they were creating a curriculum for the compulsory school education, it was like, well, that's not right, because, you know, like it was some knowledge, let's say, to do with astronomy or, you know, whatever. It was something which implied that you know, we'd existed here for much longer than the Bible said that we had. You know, and so, well, that's obviously wrong. You know, cut that out.
It's awful, isn't it? It's so awful. Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? How we edit and delete other people's stories. I was very interested recently about the discovery of the Mary Magdalene Gospels in Greece, you know, and the fact that she'd written all of these Gospels. And I was like, oh, brilliant. You know, what did these say? And the fact that they were deleted entirely, that's another part of that particular belief system, which has been left out. But I had a friend who recently lost a daughter, and she's very much since then said, you know, that she is very much into the whole thing of, I feel her everywhere. She's everywhere, and sometimes a butterfly will come or a bird will come and she go, oh, I really felt her. And whether that's the story we tell ourselves or whether that's what is happening, who knows? But it's the comfort that can give and the hope that can give is very powerful.
Yeah, because that's, you know, that reminds me of quantum physics. It's like energy isn't destroyed, you know, and if we are, you know, if we're a bundle of energy, well, we shed our physical body, but the energy is still around, isn't it? You know, it
doesn't evaporate. It's still somewhere. It has to go somewhere else, right? So I'm fascinated by that too. I think it's very, very interesting, and that's to go into the mysterious again, I suppose. What we
don't know. Yeah, there's just so much we don't know about that. And what also fascinates me is, like, when you talk about the Mary Magdalene Gospels, it's like, what fascinates me is that people try to destroy all these stories and they still don't get, they're not, they still re-emerge somehow or other. You know, how does that happen?
Yeah, it's fascinating. They're meant to be in existence somehow, and they will fight their way through, almost like they have their way
through. Yeah, the books can be burned. You know, I've heard so many examples of that. Books can be burned, they can be, you know, shred and whatever, but the story is somehow or other, it finds its way out. through different means.
Yeah, that in itself is really interesting and makes you think about, is, you know, if story's an energy, for example, then of course the story's going to find another way through, which makes sense in light of the quantum conversation yet again.
Yeah, and that's what people very often say about creativity, that creativity is something that comes through us.
Yeah.
It's like we can hear like messages, and that message just wants to come out, and either we put it on paper, or we speak to someone, you know, we say something, but somehow or other it kind of manages to keep knocking at our door until we do something with it.
Definitely. Yeah,
change something, or, you know, express it in some way. But
yeah,
that's almost as though like a story is coming through us, a message is, you know, yeah, those lost stories. And then you think about time, like, is time linear? I don't believe it is linear. And if it isn't linear, what is it then?
Yes, that's a fascinating one, isn't it? The space that's in time, you know, how much space is in a minute, a lot more than if we think of it in the linear concept, for example. It reminds me to hearing you talk there as well about the Elizabeth Gilbert big magic theory around, you know, that you show up and then your genius shows up and then you channel it somehow. I like that concept because it's the thing of, it's external to me and I can show up for it. And if I don't show up and honor it, at some point it'll go and find another host, you know, and I kind of like that. It's cute. It's a nice way to think about creativity.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I've heard that. I didn't know it was Elizabeth Gilbert. I think I've heard someone else say something similar to that it's, I think it was a poet she said that she just kind of like waits to, the poem kind of like comes and she just catches it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think Tom Waits said that as well, that he once had a word with his creative genius and said, oh, can you not see I am driving right now? Can you come back to me when I'm sitting down with some pen and paper nearby, you know? And so I think various people have alluded to that concept. And I definitely know when I'm in a creative space, sometimes it just comes and then I'm like, oh my goodness, it's keep coming. And then sometimes there's nothing for ages. And that's fascinating because that doesn't feel like it's coming from me. It feels like it's coming through me somehow.
Yes. I sometimes get into trouble when I put into words things that, you know, kind of like, you know, it's just kind of bugging me. You know, that's the way I would express it to someone. This thing really keeps bugging me, and so I'll say something to someone about it, and it's like, and it wasn't, you know, it's not taken very well. Like maybe I haven't kind of expressed it in the best way for the other person to hear, but it's like I just had to get it out.
Yeah, it needed to come out somehow. It's a powerful thing when it happens.
And that conversations with God, you know, like there's lots of examples of that, you know, people channeling books and conversations with God. It's basically, you know, we're having a conversation now, and it's like, what made us talk about Mary Magdalene? It's like, we hadn't planned on talking about Mary Magdalene, but she came up.
Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it? I remember on the Elizabeth Gilbert TED Talk again, her talking about the Olé when the Moors went into Scotland, to Spain, how it used to be Allah, Allah, when they saw someone do something amazing, which became Olé, you know, a glimpse of God, the creative genius. And I love that because it brings those concepts together so beautifully.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, brilliant, Dannie-Lu. That's been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you always. I always go away with my brain on fire after I've had a conversation with you.
I'll speak with you again very soon.
Definitely. Have a lovely week. Lovely to see you.
Bye for now.
Bye.